I think we'll try and keep to time, so I'm going to keep moving as quickly as we can. I'm going to be speaking of a sort of subset of what Professor Batra talked about, because there are two things that we're looking at, particularly on this. One is education for sustainable cities and urbanization within the SDG frame, and also climate change. So I'm going to focus on sustainable urbanization. Um, so the operational challenge at the moment is that we have had a continuous contest around what we call the urban SDGs. Um, so if you remember what I talked about last time, for those of us who were there, essentially one of the core things that we're trying to deal with in the SDG framework is this idea that SDGs are universal and all countries are developing countries. And another sort of critical element in that is the idea of no one, no place, and no ecosystem being left behind, essentially dealing with the most marginal populations, the most marginal communities within that. And our focus today, at least my focus, is going to be looking at SDG 11, the SDG on sustainable cities and communities that we negotiated over a fairly long period of time, and the relationship around knowledges and understanding of this across different parts of the world, and how one can bring that into the educational discourse. Of course, the interesting thing about this is that this was co-created almost 5 years ago. SDG 11, the final meeting was actually convened within IHS, and you can see the meeting actually going on just now. The outcome document is more or less what you see in the current frame around most of the targets and the means of implementation. This brought together not only leading academics and practitioners from across the world, but also key UN agencies and a whole range of other urban actors, including local government. But the interesting thing here is, there is an ongoing tussle that's happening at the moment. It's actually happening literally this week at the high-level political forum, which is being run virtually from New York at the UN, and it comes from a very interesting sort of political battle that's taking place. So, in some senses, over the last almost 40 years or so, urban areas, or I would say subaltern areas in some senses, because it's not only cities, have been trying to get a space within the overall development discourse. And the coming together of a whole range of different actors, academics, researchers, and of course, practitioners and policymakers, meant that there was a space that opened around this. And that's an important debate to deal with, because that's exactly the challenge that we're facing with in national spaces, whether it's India or otherwise. So what you see in the center there is the kind of sort of the headline statement of SDG 11, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. There is something in red that's actually been taken out that was lost in the negotiations, primarily because some of the East Asian countries felt that productivity was something that was much more closely associated with industrialization and economic development, and it didn't sort of lie with cities. I'm highlighting this because these are the ongoing tensions, the ongoing sort of dialectical moments that help us sort of define what should and what shouldn't be taught or sort of learned in a teaching learning environment. So the loss of the idea of productivity is something that we can see very clearly in the impact of the COVID crisis, especially in India. So in a sense, because productivity is linked with industrialization, the kind of safety nets that you would build in urban areas are something that's sort of not even within the larger UN framework. So the core challenge, like I mentioned last time, is the battle for localization. The SDGs are a complex framework. They have many limitations. They're difficult to implement. But the operational, the challenge at the moment is the battle for localization, because in a sense it was agreed internationally, but it cannot be implemented without action on the ground with citizens, with local governments, with enterprises, with a whole range of other actors, including universities as part of that process. And strategically, when we launched this process, we let go of a whole range of spaces. For example, and I'll show that you in a second, you cannot have sustainable cities which don't have adequate sanitation and water supply. But we did not try and sort of take that into the urban framework, because there was already a constituency that was focusing on water supply. You can't have sustainable cities without actually having health systems that actually deal with that. So the framework itself was a battleground of a whole range of interests, both national governments and otherwise. But what's been happening systematically over the last 4 or 5 years, and that reflects in our attempt to try and bring this into curricular practice across the world and including in India, is that the urban and sort of and the community-based processes, local processes, are trying to take back the connection with the other SDGs. And in some senses, the call to that is when we say that all SDGs are effectively urban SDGs. So I'll give you a couple of very quick examples. This is an example for work of colleagues of ours at IHS, and it deals with a very particular challenge, which is both Indian and international. So in the 1850s, the Victorians discovered sanitation. In a sense, they discovered what we now know as a linkage between clean water and sanitation and good health and well-being. And for the last, whatever, 170 years or so, this has been the single most important driver of public health impact. And we see that India has, a major program underway in both rural and urban areas around what is called Swachh Bharat Rural and Urban. But there were a whole range of unintended consequences. So in some senses today, when you walk, through a city like Delhi or Lucknow or all the way down from Haridwar to Kolkata, what you hear in some senses is the pulling of the flush that took place literally in Victoria's bedchamber in Buckingham Palace, because that is one of the first places that the flush latrine was established. It enabled the taking away of waste and putting it into rivers. But we've seen in India now 40 years of trying to clean our rivers because of what we've created. And the additional challenge, of course, is in many parts of India, at least, we have major challenges in dealing with water. As far as climate change is concerned, in many parts of the country, we have serious challenges in the future of access to water. So the question would be, if people can't have water to drink, why would you want to flush it down the toilet? So a great technological, social, and health innovation has significant consequences in urban contexts across the world, especially because our cities are now, 10, in some cases, 20 times the size of Victorian England at that point of time. So how do you deal with that? This is a particular problem that we're trying to deal with across the state of Tamil Nadu. Basically, about 70% of the people don't have the money or the access to flush-based sanitation systems. So you can't flush things down, let it go into the sewer. From the sewer, it goes into the river, it goes into a treatment system. So what do they do? What do they have? They have pit latrines and they have septic tanks. But the challenge there, of course, is you can have a Swachh Bharat program that basically builds, hundreds of millions or tens of millions of toilets. But unless the treatment of the feces is actually safe, it's not only an environmental hazard, it's a huge hazard to some of the most exploited people in the country. I mean, the bulk of sanitation systems that I've seen over the last 40 years are actually managed largely by Dalit populations. Most of the public toilets are managed by Dalit women. So it's a question not only of economics and environmental issues, but also of dealing with social equity. So an entire system has to be built. But because we've been so enamored of the Victorian toilet, but Tamil Nadu in some senses has sort of bit the bullet along with a few other states because they have serious challenges of water. So we developed this large program just now, which essentially what it does is it uses machines. They're called, on vacuum trucks. They suck up the stuff from toilets. They take them to a treatment center. This is one that we've built near the city of Coimbatore. This is actually the children's, play area inside that, because what we're trying to bring to communities is, in a culture that's completely or very strongly driven by ritual pollution, the question that these spaces are safe, you can actually take, 2,000 years, you can take feces, treat it, and you can bring it back into agriculture, and you can take the water and provide it to farmers. So that's the full system that's there. What does that mean in terms of both education and process? It basically means you have to understand how that works at a local level. At the moment, we're helping execute the building of 60 of these treatment units, which will by next year provide about 3.5 million people across over 100 urban local bodies sanitation facilities which are not sewer based. That's a really interesting thing, and it does that at maybe 1/4 of the cost, and it does that at a much it uses much less water to make that happen. But the story is not only about infrastructure. It's not only about how cities can organize their waste. I've taken one of the more sort of diabolical examples, but it's also the question of the people, especially sanitation workers. COVID is something that's really up in their face because people are talking about people in hospitals, but in fact, sanitation workers who handle not only hospital waste, but also feces which are also contaminated with COVID, are in a sense more exposed than many other people. Gender equality is a critical question. And of course, dealing with this, like we're dealing with COVID, is something that happens in school. So we have an integrated program that looks at all of these processes simultaneously. I guess the question for us is, how does it relate to the SDGs, and how do you use that then to engage with questions of education and changing practice? So if I look at the frame again, the same frame that I showed you earlier, this essentially is a connection between SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation and good health. This is the inverse of what I showed last time when we showed COVID as, in a sense, a storm that's running through this entire system. So you start with clean water and sanitation, but it's connected then with sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11, good jobs and economic growth and innovation in infrastructure. These are critical infrastructures. There are over 100,000 people in Tamil Nadu who are actively involved in this process. By changing how this works, not only deals with questions of climate action and what happens when you're dealing with drought, but it deals with questions of poverty, deals with reduced inequality, because these are among the most exposed populations in the state. And I think Pratim might talk about this because they're actively working with us on this. And of course, questions of gender equality. And finally, it comes to the question of how do you operationalize this within a decentralized framework of government. So in some senses, you start with two, but effectively, if you know how to negotiate the process and enable change at scale, you're able to touch a whole range of these ideas. So, like I said, the SDGs are a problematic frame, but they provide a pedagogic and a practical way of going in and looking at interlinkages. And I think for us, the most important part of this particular sort of innovation that's going to scale just now, it's focused very clearly on leaving no one behind, leaving no place behind, because it's about universal coverage, and very critically about leaving no ecosystem behind, because it's that provides us the ecological basis to be able to take the food that we eat, that we excrete, and take it back into the environment in a safe and sustainable manner. So that's one very concrete example. We teach this. Because we have, we have people who do both the research and the action. We teach this at the IIHS Academy at Missouri with the commissioner of, let's say, Trichy. We do this with our learners. The core challenge, I think, and we have a few colleagues here who do this kind of things in various institutions across the country. But in effect, of the 2,000 odd institutions that work on these questions in the country, I would say there are less than 5 that try and use an integrated approach to try and integrate this into the everyday practice of whether it's public health or it's architecture or it's planning or it's social work, etc. So that was just an example. But beyond that, what are the global implications of this kind of a local process? So this is one of the largest experiments of this kind in the world. It'll probably touch a few million people, 5 to 10 over the next 4 or 5 years. It's led by public investment. What does it mean at global scale? 6 or 7 very key ideas. The first thing is SDG 11 or sustainable cities means at the core of it 600 million new productive jobs by 2030, and at least a quarter of that will have to happen in India, and we know the particular challenges we're facing at the moment in a post-COVID environment. It also means safe, adequate, and well-serviced housing for about 2 billion people in slums and informal settlements. There again, India has a very large proportion of these people, with the largest concentration of people who are poor in urban areas in the world. It means secure, inclusive, built environment and universal access to green public spaces. I'm showing you examples from across the world because a question that's typically asked to me in India is, show me a place where all of this is happening. And in actual fact, in India, while we're doing lots of innovative things, there are very, very few places which will have more than a couple of these ideas. So you need to learn and draw things from different contexts. Sustainable water supply and universal access to environmental services, a remarkably innovative program that's being run in the informal settlements of Bangkok, on to scale. Over 250,000 people are accessing this. Secure regional food systems and sustainable agriculture, something that we've seen in the crisis of food security over the last few months in India, post-COVID. This is from Vancouver. Sustainable and accessible transportation, a classic image. This is from Perth, of something that's much more sustainable, uses a tremendously less energy, essentially takes a lot of what you'd see from on this highway on the right for many kilometers, and the cars, which in some senses have very little future in sustainable cities. Reliable, sustainable energy and clean manufacturing. This is an image from Copenhagen, one of the greenest cities in the world, which is sort of moving towards a carbon a positive future. and of course the deployment of disruptive technologies. So what I'm saying is we have to take those examples from very many places in the world. I just gave you one example from Tamil Nadu, and actually help sort of expand this across the world, and certainly in South Asia and in our country, to actually make this possible. The key challenge in that is we do not have people who understand how to do this and can bring all of these knowledges together. On the ground, you have people who are actually trying to manage and survive, but in effect, in the professions, there's a big challenge. So in some senses, I guess the question for us is, if you look at sustainable development in a post-COVID era, uh, what can we actually see? At the moment, part of the discussion at HLPF in New York, at the UN, is a significant setback to the 2030 agenda. In some senses, especially if you look at India's case, because India is going to be critical in this process, is that you might have a slipping back to 2040. What would that mean? Is, I guess, a very important question that we have to engage with as pedagogists, as researchers, as practitioners, as policymakers. The other thing, of course, is there is a huge pushback that you're seeing very quietly but quite strongly in many parts of the world of a return to a pre-COVID world. And there are some deep questions there. I think Professor Batra touched on some of them. Giving up on addressing inequality, the thing that's come out very clearly. Giving up on addressing climate and environmental change. One of the most dramatic challenges opportunities we've seen is a significant reduction in climate emissions. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in Delhi at the moment. Even though things are coming back just now, our air quality is still moderately decent. And of course, and we're seeing this across the world, a tighter embrace of authoritarianism, especially in a context in which uncertainty is something that many citizens, a lot of populations are willing to give up on because they think that authoritarians may be the way to move forward on that. So having said that, I'll just look at two very simple examples of how one can take the learnings that we have, looking at what happens in sustainable cities, and bring that into an educational environment, both things that we've actually had a sort of hand in. The first is a massive open online course that we started about 3 or 4 years ago. Some of the people who are critically involved in actually framing this agenda across the world came together, about 27 of us. And it's interesting to see how that sits in the current framework just now of an online world. This is data from yesterday. So if you look at the top 5 courses in the world, of course, at the top you have Ed Glazer's course from Harvard, which is very much about the world as it is. It starts with Rome and London and New York and stuff like that. It's focused on a world, I think, that we're about to leave at the moment. And then you have ETH Zurich and doing very much sort of northern organized knowledges for most of us, especially in this project, looking at knowledges that come from very different contexts. And then you have what we're doing just now on sustainable cities, largely from the global south at number 4. But the important thing here is not what the ranking is. The fact is we're able to reach out to people from 150 countries. Now, this is maybe not a big thing. It's a 10-week course. It has 50 modules. It deals with most of the questions that are there. But there are new opportunities that come from this. Obviously, criticality, proposition is something that we cannot deal with this. But bringing people into a new way of thinking and working, connecting them up with practices is something that this provides us an opportunity to reach out from. As most of us as educators would know that, in your lifetime, in some senses, you would rarely be able to reach out to these kind of people. But as I said earlier, this is not a substitute. It cannot be a substitute for sort of in-person engagement, which is what sort of helps us engage and understand these questions. A very quick structural response. The hard way, that was the easy way in some senses. The hard way to transform educational systems is what we've been trying to do in the last few years, almost a decade at IHS. So what is the question that we're trying to address here? Basically, we're trying to address the question of poverty at scale, from 350 to 400 million people, another coming into urban areas. This is the single largest rural to urban transition in human history. And it's not just a demographic transition, as it's kind of made up to be. It's about migration, etc. It's fundamentally a cultural transition. And in some senses, India's national development hinges on our urbanization being handled with wisdom, which I think we've shown a deep lack of, especially in the last 2 or 3 months. And of course, if India succeeds, the world will succeed in achieving the SDGs, because the pivot in some senses sits around Indian urbanization and of course the climate question. So we've tried to establish, or we are in the process of establishing, a national university that's built around the idea of sustainable urbanization. But 3 critical things in this It's built around the idea of new knowledges. It's built around the idea of using those new knowledges to, in some cases, educate a new generation of interdisciplinary urban scholars and practitioners. We heard this in the last session that we had from a number of people. And of course, do something that, we've been talking about now, I guess, since the 1970s, and that is see whether we can bridge the gap between quality, inclusion, and scale. And that's a very tough thing to do, but that's what we're attempting to do. So how do we do that? We do that by establishing an institution that brings within the framework of the institution, unlike sort of traditional universities, research, practice, teaching, and capacity building together in one institution. And that's a difficult thing to do, but that, I guess, a heterodox design is what we're looking at in trying to sort of enable this process to work itself out. The other thing which sometimes confuses people is they say, okay, university, where are your departments? Where are the disciplines within that? The disciplines for us, 40 odd of them, as you can see on the left-hand side, are embedded within the connections that we see around the urban domain. So, in a sense, the urban is the way in, but the interconnections are the most critical things, whether it's, and you can see the clusters, you have social sciences, management at one end, mathematics and statistics, they're all being pulled together. So basically, we are talking about transformational knowledge about the urban in India and the global south, both within the disciplines and across that, with interdisciplinarity as the core, and an emphasis on building grounded theory and applying research into practice. And what I showed you just now in Tamil Nadu is, in a sense, doing that in active real time. What are the outcomes? This is one of the most interesting things that we've been able to do. A multi-year process for developing a global curriculum, which is rooted in the global south, with about 200 people, which is a very different structure from what the UGC and a whole range of other academic institutions have tried to build. This program, in some senses, has become the gold standard in the urban space for trying to look at how interdisciplinary teaching and learning will happen. It's been picked up, and we're working with colleagues in different parts of the world, in Africa, in the United States, in Europe, in trying to pick up the learnings that we have from this. So basically, we know that we can teach and learn in this way. We can enable the education of people who can bring all of these ideas together, who in some senses are what we call system integrators. And then, we have an active research agenda, and, in some senses, people look at interdisciplinarity and think of it as being something very soft, very fuzzy, and, all over the place. In actual fact, over the last decade or so, we've built, I think, a pretty strong research agenda, which is, in some senses, at the frontiers of human knowledge. The first thing that you see up the left there is something that I don't know whether Professor Parnell is on this call, but this is a significant piece of work that was done for Nature Sustainability, looking at new urban science. On the right is probably one of the most cited science publications of 2018, which is the IPCC special report on 1.5 that we helped anchor. And in between, you see, the pivot out to dealing with policymakers, and of course, a pretty well cited article in Nature. So in a sense, what we're saying is, when you're starting to bring together these ideas and these practices, you not only have to be at the cutting edge on the ground, because that's where the change is actually happening, you also have to change the discourse, the framing of how knowledge is created, and how it can be sort of rebuilt and reconstructed in different contexts. Without that, decolonization, dealing with sort of epistemic justice, etc., are things that are nice words to deal with, but it's a real struggle that we find in making this possible.